Welcome everyone to the Fire These Times. This episode we are joined by a returning guest, Musa Okwonga, to talk about a piece that he wrote last October 2023 entitled "The Hate is Accelerating." Obviously, everything that we'll mention will include those in the description. On the broad topic being racism in Germany. And the topic of this specific conversation, the reason I wanted to have Musa on is that, him and I have these chats pretty often alongside Fabien and Justin, who are also repeated guests on the podcast. And we have also in our separate context kind of seen things deteriorating in many ways, but Germany has this very specific thing about it due to the reasons that we'll get into exactly. Musa, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself first?
Sure, yeah. I'm a writer, I'm an author, and co-host of a football podcast called Stadio. I'm based in Berlin. I've been here for almost 10 years now.
Mm-hmm. And so the way I wanted to start this chat, because I mentioned you wrote this essay in October 2023, let's start with a bit of background in the sense of why did you feel the need to write it at the time? Because then the natural follow-up question, of course, would be how have things changed since then? And we'll see how to get into that. But first,
no, of course,
yeah. Why did you write it?
So I wrote it because I had to write this before I could write anything else, because I was working on some new fiction, some non-fiction, and this felt almost like a writer's block, which in itself was interesting. I was struggling to write about this. And whenever I struggle to write about something, I think, let me push in that direction because that reluctance is telling me something. So for a few months prior to writing it, I've been noticing different things, occurrences here and there, a bit like when you're, the advance of climate change, you're seeing animals waking up earlier from hibernation because the weather's changed. And it felt like that. I was noticing stuff that I hadn't seen before. I was noticing an emboldened far right, and I felt like I was noticing more and more data points. Like one data point by itself is nothing, but I was seeing so many more of them that eventually I was like, no, something's definitely happening. So over the course of a few months, I started jotting down things I've been noticing about the rise of fascism and the far right. And the culmination came, I finally got the urge to write the piece when I was at a house party, only about 15 minutes walk from my house. And I was at a house party one night, it was just before midnight, and somebody dropped a large stone slab, basically aimed at somebody who was sitting on a deck chair at the house party I was at. Any one of us could have been sitting there, and this slab of stone basically shattered into 6 or 7 pieces, and it could have killed someone. As in, if it was dropped from the 4th floor, and the only reason it didn't hit someone is because the aim was slightly off, but it basically landed an inch from this person's skull. If it had landed on their skull, at the very least, I think it puts them in a coma.
Yeah.
So it was, and I shared this news on social media, and 2 people wrote to me and they said, "This looks like attempted murder." Spoke to the police about it. No real follow up, but at that point, I'm like, "Yeah, this is really happening," because the party was a party of. It was basically hosted by a bunch of guys from Cameroon. The majority of us were black. There were I think 3 or 4 white people. This was very clearly a black hosted party. They complained about, apparently they've been shouting about noise. The thing is, Elia, the thing that struck me about it was the escalation of the violence. And then, a few months later, a couple of months ago, we're jumping ahead slightly, but a couple of months ago, a Cameroonian man was stabbed to death over a parking place dispute.
Yeah.
So it's the escalation. What's happening is a trend of black people in public spaces or shared spaces having disagreements, and the disagreements escalating to a fatal level. So yeah, that's why I felt the inclination to write it. And since the events of October 7th, since Hamas attacked Israel and killed I think over 1,000 people,
or so, yeah.
1,200 or so, yeah. Since Hamas did that, the conversation has changed in Germany for the worse. Absolutely.
And what was the response to that piece of yours?
The response was that, well, I can give you the immediate response. 400 hate messages on social media from, well, the first one that came in was from a city councillor, the far right Alternative for Germany. That was the first response, the top response.
So there's someone in German because the piece was
Yeah,
published in both languages. Yeah, okay.
yeah, German. And I wanted it to be present in German because I wanted Germans to understand what I saw was happening. And the essay is like, it's a diagnostic. It's saying this is what's happening. It also said, look, here are the good things about this country, and if you don't fight for them, you'll lose them.
Mm-hmm.
And the response, 400 comments, and I think that they locked the comments after a certain point. Actually, the site to protect me, maybe. But someone wrote, I think, journalist James Jackson wrote, Musa's essay. The point of his essay is proven by the response.
Yeah.
To it, like that is. And the funny thing is, some of the responses came in so quick. Some of them can't have read the article. Like they came in so fast. I mean, the essay is like 4,500 words, so some of them didn't even read it. But those who did read it were still furious. But the comments to the actual article were Germans going, "Hey, this guy really cares about this country, and he's trying to tell us something. We need to read it. We need to listen." So yeah, I feel like I wrote this essay obviously in October 2023, and I would say that by every major metric, and it's not to say there's not resistance to fascism, there's not strong pro-democracy movements, but it feels like German democracy in a significantly worse state than it was when I wrote this in October. And it feels like daily. It's almost like those you see those videos of like the icebergs melting.
Yep.
And nothing seems to be happening for years on end. And in the space of just a few months, weeks, even days, you just see huge shards of ice just collapsing into the ocean.
Yeah.
That's how German democracy feels right now, if I'm honest.
Like the process is both very slow, but at the same time, it can be very fast at times.
Absolutely. And we're in a period now of, I think, it's very rare. I think when you start seeing the political level and the street level like converging. So when you start seeing stuff at a street level that you're seeing happen in the highest realms of politics, and then you're seeing stuff it's so weird. Like you're seeing stuff happen at political level, and then you're seeing it on the street and vice versa. When that's happening, then it's bad. And I've got specifics about it we'll get into later. But yeah, I really feel things I'm seeing on the street, sometimes in my own street, I'm seeing reflected in newspapers, in the press. Yeah, it is.
Because the fact that it was released just like a few days after October 7th, at least the English version. I don't know if the German version was published before or after.
It was delayed. It was meant to come out before. It was written before. This is the funny thing.
Yeah.
It was written before October the 7th. I was actually at a literature festival when the events took place, when Hamas attacked. So my first instinct then was I sort of got in touch with all my Jewish friends who I knew have relatives in Israel, just to check in and be like, look, because it's such a small country, that who's been affected? Are you okay? And they were like, no, like no one we know has been affected. But it felt like everyone knew someone who knew someone because it's a small population. And then it was really just the fallout of that. And the essay kind of emerged into that space. And at that point, I was like, I want this essay to just sit and people to just take it in of itself and be like, look, but of course, Israel's got a far right government. And this was an acknowledged. The thing that struck me about all of this is another side topic, but it did struck me that the conversation about Israel having a far right government that its own people have been protesting in significant numbers and maybe unprecedented numbers for months kind of was forgotten in the fallout within Germany. That it was almost forgotten that the Israeli government was in some sense, potentially its actions are a long-term existential threat to the fabric of Israeli society. But a lot of that was forgotten in the aftermath of October 7th.
Yeah, that's what a lot of, and I have come up with, sorry, I've found a bunch of links I had read and talks and podcasts and whatnot since October that I will include in the show notes. And they are more or less all of them, I think, by either German Jews or Jews in Germany. In some cases, Israeli Jews that have some kind of connection to Germany, and they've lived there, or maybe they are, originally from there in terms of like their grandparents or whatever. And there's been this very It's this weird thing. You mentioned the metaphor earlier of like seeing the iceberg and whatnot. And I one thing that always comes to mind is someone who's like at the, I don't know, at the beach or whatever, and is quite literally seeing a tsunami coming. And you like seeing it with their own eyes. And sometimes in my mind, I was like, I can see it, and I'm just trying to tell people, hey, look there. You know, it's that whole "don't look up" thing in that movie. And so to go back to the initial point, that what they have written, I can even just mention the titles of this because it's pretty straightforward. One by George Prochnik, Eyal Feisman, and Emily Dish Becker on Granta, a two-parter. And the title is, once again, Germany defines who is a Jew. The three of them are Jewish, if I'm not mistaken. At least two of the three. I don't know about the third person. There is another one, a podcast on Jewish currents, the podcast called On the Nose, and it's the part 1 and part 2 called The Trouble with Germany, and they kind of have a very similar conversation on that. And I've seen this repeated time and time again of progressive Jews. Some may have not even considered themselves, for example, anti-Zionist, because there's just that terminology hasn't kind of come into their world. But let's say they are like non-Zionist. It's not something that's like necessarily a part of their heritage, let's say. Finding themselves in a context, in this case Germany post-October, where it's almost like there was this entire baggage that was already prepared for them in advance, and they had to either fit it or they just don't exist. And that's the point of that article on Granta, like Germany defines who is a Jew, because for those who don't know, there's been a lot of arrests, of course, and repression and just censorship and whatnot against lots of folks in Germany who kind of say virtually anything on Palestine, and including folks who are Jews. And there's been this very bizarre upside down, well, at least it feels like, thing where you would have primarily non-Jewish politicians and, you know, police officers and the leader of whatever the committee to, I forgot, I'm sure you know the term in German, the groups in each state, they are kind of like the commissioners on anti-Semitism or whatever. They are mostly non-Jewish as well, and they tend to actually have the legal right, essentially, to go to that Jewish person and say, what you have said right now is anti-Semitic, because they have defined that term in their own ways. Anyway, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no. I think I will say that there's so much to say since October 7th. I think within Germany there's a lot going on. So there is, first of all, there is a significant plurality of opinion within the Jewish community in Germany.
Sure.
Both those visiting, those living here, and that plurality exists within and among friends of mine. Some who are extremely critical of the actions of the Israeli government, insofar as they will assess them as war crimes and genocide, and others who will assess it as a just war, a just response. And I think the challenge is that plurality is not represented in the German conversation, the German response context, academia. It's not. I think progressive Jews, three of whom friends of mine who signed an open letter to this extent, very, very concerned about the conflation of the actions of Netanyahu's government and the proclamations of his government. The conflation of that with Jewish identity, they find extremely troubling. I find it troubling. They speak from a place of personal, I would say, authority in that sense, because they're in the center of the conversation. I think I have the luxury and the privilege of not being in the center of that, but they are very exposed, and they're experiencing severe professional, personal sanction as a result of being outspoken on this issue. Now, I would say this about the mood in Germany since October has been extremely fraught. So, and the danger, again, the conflation of Jewish identity with critique of what Israel is doing. So you're having, for example, Stars of David appearing on apartment blocks. Now, the danger there, of course, is a lot of the conversation about Israel is not sophisticated, right? And that sounds like I'm being sophisticated, maybe sounds patronizing. It's not nuanced. So these words, these terms, Zionism is a specific academic term description. It is also an anti-Semitic dog whistle. It's that both things can be true. So
absolutely.
It is used and co-opted, and I think the lack of nuance about that conversation has understandably unsettled a lot of Jewish people. Some of them are friends of mine, about when they say Zionism, what they're talking about. And there's a reason why, therefore, I don't use a lot of terms like that in conversation, because my initial instinct and my ultimate instinct has always been, how do we address and fix this current and historic, like,
Yeah.
it's a mess. How do you
Yeah.
address it? So my primary thing is, where's the empathy? So my thing is, first of all, how do we save as many Palestinian lives as possible? How do we stop Israel, this bombing operation? How do we stop this now?
Mm-hmm.
How do we save the lives of as many Israeli hostages as possible now? And that is a joint claim and call I've made on all my social media since October, because it feels inadequate. I'm just one person, but that feels the most productive way forward. Let's stop this right now, and then what is the path we can push forward from? And all of my kind of, I hesitate to call it's not activism, because I'm not as brave as these activists doing the work that is really needed. But in as far as I'm writing and talking about this stuff, and the far right and the fascists, how do we emerge from this with a core of people who act in solidarity to address the threat that faces us all? Because have no doubt the far right are advancing, and they despise Palestinians, and they despise Jewish people, and they despise Israelis, and they're coming. I mean, I can jump on a train round the corner from here, and I can be at the door of a regular meeting place of the violent far right in less than an hour. I can go tonight to the restaurant where they regularly meet, where they plan violence, where they're unleashing violence that hasn't been seen in my district for 10 years in Berlin. That's how close this stuff is.
To your point, I mean, I actually also agree. I try to be as careful as I can when I'm
Yeah.
writing online versus, for
Yeah.
example, when I'm talking. Because when I'm talking, I have more time to add some nuance and folks, of course, I would hope, would have, especially if they're listening to this podcast, that there is a bit of a relationship of trust, because, there's like 200 almost episodes so far. And this topic, I mean, has been brought up in the past, and I've tried to kind of do it due diligence, because I've even had an entire episode on anti-Semitism specifically on the left, because it's a very specific phenomenon that's different than the dominant one, which is the one on the far right and on the right. And so, when I'm writing online, for the most part, I'm very more specific. I say, like, pro Netanyahu, or apologists of the Israeli government, or whatever, like stuff like that, because I've seen there's been some controversies, and this is a difficult topic. We won't dwell too much on this, because it's not necessarily the main point. And also I'm going to have an episode with Daniel Voskoboynik, one of my co-hosts, in the next few days, actually, on much closer to this very specific topic. I lost my train of thought a bit. Yeah, this topic is a complex one, and more importantly, the specific way a word is used is not the same as how it is heard, how it is received.
Yes.
And Yair Wallah had written a paper, I think, some years ago, called, like, arguing that even the term Zionism should be considered a zombie category, which is an academic term, just meaning it kind of it can mean everything and nothing, to the point that it loses.
It's like the word woke. It's not the same as the word woke, but in the same way that
very much.
a word has been given invested with multiple meanings. Yeah.
Pretty much. So, someone like Edward Said writing about Zionism is not the same as someone like, I don't know, on some random person on Twitter, because even then that depends who is that person, what's their positionality, But regardless of who that person is, the person reading it, on the other side of the phone or the laptop, whatever, may have a different baggage associated with that term. And so it is important, even not just only as a matter of, like, ethics, because you don't want to just trigger people randomly, or just insult someone, or even, like, be misunderstood. Like, why would one willingly want to be misunderstood?
Right.
Tactically, it's something that doesn't make much sense. It's something that I think has. We can close this one. As I say, we'll get into more in that.
No, but actually, I like that you said this, and I want to add to this as well.
Please.
I found this, especially since I've got Israeli friends in Germany, the most extreme case of whom basically has had a load of friends just cut him off because they've said, after 20 years of friendship, it's an extreme case, but it's like, I disagree with what Israel's doing. Before we meet for coffee, can I ascertain what your view is on it? And he's like, we can't meet for coffee yet. Like, that is a thing. That's a thing that's happened literally just a few. And him and I caught up. We were talking about stuff, and he said, "Look, what did you expect Israel to do in relation to what Hamas did?" And I said, "Hey, dude, here's the thing. Like, there's a range of responses." I said, "Okay, here's the first example." I said, "Look, first of all, they could have had. I'm glad you've asked me." I said they could have had a month of mourning where they said, "Look, the world is invited to grieve the loss of the mass loss of the mass loss of civilian life with us." And then they could have said, "Look, okay, your guy Hanieh lives in Qatar. Qatar owns Paris Saint-Germain Football Club. Let's suspend Paris Saint-Germain from European competition for years because that will hit you in the prestige pocket, for example." And he was looking at me like, "Oh," I said, "Look, I'm just saying, when you have civilians living in a dense population like Gaza, and you know that civilian deaths, like a huge number of civilian deaths, are inevitable, right? And if we look at some of the targeting, I mean, like even Joe Biden called it indiscriminate bombing. Like, if you know that is coming down the road, then you're looking for solutions that are as little focused on the military as possible, for example." And then we had this great, like, hour-long conversation about all of it because I think he'd seen this guy has empathy for me as an individual, and he really does care about the hostages. He cares about Israeli life as much as Palestinian life.
I would say on that,
Yeah,
I have had some folks, mostly, yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, they were all Jewish, because as I said, because of the specific works of how I approach things, as I mean,
yes,
as much as I try to,
mm,
I've gotten that comment a number of times, like, I'm reaching it from a point of empathy. And
yes,
that's an important thing. I'll explain why. We talked about this, you and I, on that group a few days ago as well, because we have seen a weird dichotomy between different
mm,
sides, quote unquote. I'm not talking in Israel, Palestine, I'm talking like outside in the West and Europe,
yes,
whatnot.
yes,
Of like, on the one side, you have people saying free the hostages. And on
mm,
the other hand, you'll have people say ceasefire now.
mm.
Those are the same thing.
Absolutely,
You
absolutely,
cannot
yes,
have one without the other. And we've seen it. The Israeli
yes,
state has actually tried to have one without the other. And they've
mm,
rescued a handful of people. They've killed a number of people. And the rest of
mm.
them are still there.
Right,
And that should have been something, I think, in retrospect. I don't want this to be a blaming thing because
no,
especially the day itself was very traumatic, of course. And then the
yes,
response itself was just a series of traumas upon traumas upon traumas. And lots of people
yes,
reacted accordingly. And in and of itself, that's not something that I'm like here to judge or whatever. I think taking some distance, at least to the extent that that's even possible, I think it should just be concluded. I think it's almost like as objective as it can be at this point that and I'm not saying some folks have done this. This is not like
yes,
this is not like
yes,
rocket science or anything. I'm not like reinventing the wheel or whatnot. There were lots of folks who were saying, ceasefire now equals release of the hostages, of course, because
yes, yes.
why wouldn't it? This is the entire point of having, even from the perspective, when I put it that way, of Hamas, was as a kind of as a kind of what do you call this? Like as a um,
Just negotiating this, well, it's
yeah,
crudely, yeah, but
exactly.
yeah, a bargain, yeah, it's a
Exactly. Yeah,
bargain
a
of the
bargaining
lives
chip.
of,
And
yeah,
no
yeah,
one has to like this. This is not, please, I mean, I don't think anyone listening to this will misunderstand me on
no, no,
this,
no,
but
no, no,
that's just how things are. And you can have the attitude, oh, we do not negotiate with terrorists, the famous Bush
mm,
era thing, even though they did, which is not openly. Or you can have a almost realism applied to the
mm,
situation and try and understand why did something like this happen. Of course, blame the people who did the actual horrors. There's no reason not to do both of those. But then you try and take a step back and you try and understand, well, what happened every like 10, 15, 20 years before October 7th? And you don't have to, this does not lead to, therefore, this was a good thing.
mm.
These two don't think, you're
Well,
just
this is,
trying
and
to
this,
understand
oh
how
my
A
God,
led to B.
thank you. And I thank you so much because in a German context, what I found not merely frustrating, but dangerous for the discourse, I feel like a lot of the German coverage, I think I sent you some, I think I sent you something quite early on. I think a couple of weeks into October,
Mm,
I sent you a screenshot of Tagesspiegel, one of the big publications here, and it was the front cover, and it said dozens of Hamas fighters killed in an Israeli offensive. And by this point, it had been documented that thousands of Palestinian civilians had already been killed
yeah.
in the Israeli offensive. And I was like, wow, you're actually giving more dignity and death to Hamas, like who killed hundreds hundreds of civilians, you're giving more dignity and death to them than to Palestinian civilians who
That's
are just going
exactly
about
it.
their business. And that's mind-blowing to me. And I said, this is extremely dangerous, because then what you're doing is you're giving the impression that that Israel's actions have been some kind of surgical strike. This is the same language we saw, shock and awe, collateral damage, this sort of sanitizing language, though. And these strikes have not been surgical. Like, they've been far from it, like absolutely far from it. So then what we're looking at now, so this was Tagesspiegel, and there was an article written Der Spiegel, which in its own way was even worse. It was a thousands of words critiquing Greta Thunberg for her comments on
Yeah,
all of this.
we all remember that one.
Here's the key section that didn't really get noticed much. I was looking at this, and it was talking about Palestinians, and it said, Palestinians who struggled for self-determination. I was like, okay, well, if you're going to talk about that, spell it out. The only date it mentioned, I think, was 1967. Didn't mention 1948. And I was like, hang on a minute. How can you talk about Palestinians and not mention 1948 if you're mentioning dates in an article that's 5,000 words long? And I was like, these omissions are deliberate.
Yeah, I mean, if you're willing to go as far back as the 60s, why aren't you including 48? Well, it's not that far back.
Unacceptable. On a related note, the New York Times wrote a long piece, an interview with Ismail Haniyeh. I think it came out shortly. I think it was a few weeks afterwards, where he was like, "Oh, like, this is all part of the strategy to put Palestinians at the center of the conversation again." And I'm a bit critical of that, because I felt like he fitted in that after the event, because I think he was concerned by the extent of what Hamas did. I don't think he was expecting that to be.
We know for a fact by now, if I'm not mistaken, that he wasn't actually informed on the day of.
They weren't coordinating. But the
Yeah.
interview he gave to the New York Times implied that he'd been like, "Oh, I was the center all along." I think
Sure. Of course, he's going to say that. Yeah.
But here's the striking thing that wasn't really picked up in the New York Times piece, because it was providing context to all of this. It didn't talk about the fact that, like, Netanyahu basically had treated Hamas had underestimated them, but treated them, I think, as a convenient enemy. It hadn't mentioned any of that context. And I'm like, hang on a minute. These are like Tagesspiegel, Der Spiegel, New York Times. This is a failure of journalism.
Yeah.
It's a failure of journalism. And also, as well, like, you're going to talk about Palestinian resistance and not mention the Great March of Return. Like, this is unbelievable, because the Great March of Return, the whole point of that was it was meant to be a space, a peaceful space where people were going, and it got co-opted in the end not co-opted. The bad faith actors tried to claim it, but the core of the March of the Return was everything that Germany, it was everything that the US, everything that Israeli politicians claimed to want from a Palestinian resistance. And it wasn't mentioned in the German discourse. And I found this enraging, because hang on a minute, because now you've got Palestinians out in the street protesting, trying to bring about a ceasefire, and all of them were being tagged with the tag of, "Oh, this is a hate march."
Yeah.
Like, it's absolutely, to me, and I watched this and I was like, the powerlessness that so many Palestinians were feeling in Germany continue to feel, because every day that we talk, every second that we talk, people are starving, people are dying, like, hostages are in captivity, like, all of this. And it feels, even as I speak to you, I feel this, it's a deep frustration, because every second that passes, the pain continues. And the failure for that lies at the heart of, I would say, the German state and the German media. Yeah. Absolutely, it does. Yeah.
So here's where I stand on this. It's very much what you said. Just to add a bit, I've paid a lot of attention to what, like, relatives of the hostages themselves have said. And in some cases, some of the released hostages have said as well. Which, if you kind of try and, again, take a step back and not filter it immediately through what, let's say, like, what Netanyahu wants this to be interpreted as, or what the West thinks, or whatever, just as a normal human response in many ways. Of course, you will have some relatives of hostages that are very vengeful, and they say, we must do everything, and many of them do buy into the narrative that, the IDF is a moral army, and they will do everything they can in order to rescue our loved one or whatnot. So that's like one category of folks. Others are more straightforward in many ways, even from the very, very start. On October 7th itself, if not October 8th, I remember one man whose both of his parents were killed, not even taken hostage, but killed on October 7th. And he was very explicit in saying that like no one is going to accuse him of sympathizing with Hamas, obviously. But he still had to kind of say like he does not want this to escalate. He doesn't want this to be used as an excuse for wider conflict and whatnot. And we've actually seen quite a few folks like that.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Even the couple, like the couple of folks who spoke at the DNC, basically said more humane things about Palestinians than a lot of like high-ranking politicians claiming to be speaking in their names. And that's not unusual. Even if you go back like historically, if you have some like tragedy like if you're going through something, either like your loved one is still kidnapped or maybe your loved one was killed, it's not guaranteed. It's not even like inevitable. I mean, that you will immediately think of like, what's the best way I can take, like how can I take revenge in the best, most efficient way possible? Most people are still mourning, are in shock, of course. And they see that there is a group of people that did a certain act, and they are able to apply basic human nuance and see that, well, there are 2.2 million human beings in Gaza, the vast majority of whom are actually under 18. So even if you want to use the argument of like, oh, most people voted for Hamas at the time, which isn't even true, but even if you want to use that, that was in 2006.
Yes.
Most people who exist today were either too young or did not even exist at the time. And we're still using this kind of, in the narrative, there's still this kind of collective punishment essentially being used. Okay. All of this all of this to say, Germany itself, I will admit, like, and I mean, I know you know this, and some folks who have, I don't know if on this podcast I've mentioned it, but I was interviewed on a different podcast called, I think it was Non Serviam, where I mentioned this a few times, that I admit, like, and this isn't like, I'm not boasting, I'm not proud of it necessarily, but I've felt very cynical about Germany, especially since October. In and of itself, not starting in October, there are certain things about German history that still angers me. I've put it that way in this specific way in that interview, that like I'm still angry about the Holocaust, in the sense that like I have this, maybe it's just a way I interpret history or whatnot, where I don't take for granted the distances between certain dates, as in like, oh, this finished in 1948, therefore it has nothing to do with me, because of course that's just not that. I don't think it's like objectively accurate, and also I don't think ethically it's the right thing to do. And so I reacted, thankfully not online, and thankfully I don't have an online presence that's that big anymore, but like with like folks around me on Signal, on WhatsApp or whatever, when I would hear these speeches by Scholz, by other like German politicians, journalists, like German journalists and various media publications, talk about anti-Semitism as if it's their personal duty to make sure that that they can even speak on behalf of Jews. That's one thing that really pisses me off. And the second thing, that they have immediately assigned anti-Semitism almost like as an inherent trait of being Arab or Muslim or Palestinian or whatever, even though to this day, the vast majority of anti-Semitic attacks in Germany, even today, still come from the far right. Because why wouldn't it?
Right.
There's more of them, of the far right, I mean. And that really pisses me off. Like that genuinely makes me like, I'm not rational even when I feel this, because I've seen way too many movies, documentaries, read books by either Holocaust survivors or on the Holocaust or whatever, that my reaction is like, how dare you? You know, like, how dare you tell me this? It wasn't my grandparents. How dare you tell me this right now? I know why they would, and I can all rationalize and go through like the politics of like, you know, German Staatsräson and the memory culture, how it's instrumentalized and weaponized and all of that stuff. And some of those are in the links that are included in the show notes. But emotionally, it still pisses me off.
There's something else going on there about Germany. And to your point, there's something else going on here. And I think there's a reason why these conversations happen. So I think there's a parallel with Ukraine in one sense, and that's the insularity of German discourse on this issue. So a conversation about anti-Semitism in Germany, actually a lot of the time, is actually a conversation not about Jewish people, but about Germans having a conversation about their own identity.
Yeah.
And you see this in relation to Ukraine as well. So you have Olaf Scholz, you have Ukrainian politicians begging him for weapons, and then Olaf Scholz going on social media tweeting, can one really achieve peace with war? And tweeting these, you know, while Ukrainian towns are being shelled into oblivion, Olaf Scholz is on social media pontificating. Why does that happen? It happens for the same reason a lot of German politicians presume to speak for a singular Jewish identity in Germany, which does not exist. because it's Germans talking about Germans
Yeah.
through the prism of this issue. And I think that happens because, and this is the key point I get around to, I think that happens because Germany, yes, it's the biggest economy in the EU, but if you think about how German culture penetrates the rest of the world, it's not like French culture where you have films and like hip hop and whatever, and you have more people speaking French than speak German or whatever. Because French culture exports so much, more people keep an eye on France.
Yeah.
More people are looking into France.
Yeah.
Because Germany doesn't have that cultural reach, I think more stuff goes under the radar.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people are assessing Germany with a view of Germany that actually is more quite complacent, or complacent's maybe harsh, less informed than it might be. So for Germany's like political importance, its cultural imprint isn't as broad as you'd expect. So a lot of people, when they talk about Germany, are talking about the playbook of, oh, but it's dealt with its like Nazi past, it's come to terms with its past. Look, I mean, we both know this. Like, Comrade Adenauer, unrepentant anti-Semite,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a foundation, the
Yeah.
Comrade Adenauer Foundation, that's named after him, whose aim is to basically stamp out anti-Semitism. And look, they do a lot of really interesting work, but they're called. I mean, they're named after him. That is the
Yeah.
extent to which it's bone deep. A lot of the denial is bone deep in this country in a lot of areas, and the reason why it's so hard to have a conversation about race in Germany is a lot of people are like, "We've dealt with that." But if you dig a bit deeper, a few hours later, the conversation is like, "Yeah, actually, we know we haven't dealt with that." Like there are entire towns. There's a town actually, the town of Cottbus. You go to Cottbus, and actually, like a lot of the major institutions have people with prominent far right views in the infrastructure. Like it's difficult to get a lot done at a major institutional level in major parts of the East without engaging with the far right, but also in North Rhine-Westphalia and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. Like this is it's a big, it's a deep problem, and I think look, we're recording this episode in advance of the state elections
Yeah.
in the East. So by the time this podcast drops, like people will have seen the results. I think that the rest of Germany is in for a big shock
Mm.
when those results drop, because the radicalization here of the far right it's deep, and it's also happening. Like this is the key thing: it's happening among the young.
Yeah.
So they are the most popular party among young people. That has the jump in popularity. I think it's the 18 to 29-year-olds has risen from 7% just 2 years ago to 22% now.
Mm-hmm.
That's an astonishing rise in just 2 years.
Yeah. 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 I'm curious about this as well. If
Yeah.
kind of like a bit of a thought experiment in some sense, because I had Aurélien Mondon on like about I don't know, a month ago. So in the title of that episode, I had him on earlier to talk about this concept of the populist hype.
Mm.
I'll quickly define it just because the term can be misleading. I think how it's can be misunderstood. I mean, it doesn't mean that like populism in the sense of the far right specifically in this case is not dangerous because being hyped up
Mm.
might imply that. It's more that the way it is covered in the media for the most part is treated
Mm.
as if it's the default politics, i.e. that
Yes.
there is an implication. We mentioned a very specific Guardian article, for example, that was talking about the rise of the far right in East Germany.
Mm.
And at no point, or there was like a throwaway line about like racism, or white
Right. Yeah.
supremacy or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yes. Yes.
It's like
Yes.
economic anxiety or whatever, stuff like that. And even using the actual quotes by like professed
Their
members of the
framing.
far right. Yeah.
Their framing. It's
Yeah.
it's mind blowing.
Yeah.
This is what gets me enraged. There's a brilliant activist. There's a lot of brilliant activists doing work in East Germany. Shout out to Jakob Springfeld, who's doing incredible work organizing on the ground in Saxony. Shout out to David Begrich, a brilliant academic in the far right. Philip Rook, who's written a book I'm desperately trying to get published in English, which is called 5 Minutes Before 1933, basically talking about Weimar Germany's complacency as the far right basically exploded and rose in the
Mm,
30s. He says we're there again. Like we have, it is absolutely alarm bells ringing. We have the national elections in November 2025. And as things stand, I think we're going to see the far right form part of a coalition government with a wholly acquiescent a conservative party. Like there are people doing work on the ground, and it's so frustrating because those people are also the East Germans. They're also Saxony. They're doing incredible work on the ground, but none of their framing is existing. When you see these articles being written, about the far right, they always get the last word. When is the last time we had somebody from a refugee camp that got attacked by the far right interviewed? A friend of mine, I said to the other day, I said, why are we not going out there and saying that actually it's good that immigrants come to Germany? And she said, Musa, that's electoral suicide. And I said, electoral suicide? You're of Turkish German heritage at the very least. I thought you would at least be in the corner of some. You're trying to do this thing of like, I'll keep my head down. They won't come after me. I'm like, when the Syrians came to Germany, almost a million of them, but Merkel let them in. I think it's the best thing she did when she was in office. When Merkel brought Syrians to Germany, I said, I never saw a single Syrian interviewed on national TV about what they've been through. So it was a conversation about Syrians.
Yeah.
How many Palestinians do you see on mainstream TV talking about what they're going through? It's a conversation about Palestinians. Gayath Almadoun, Palestinian Syrian poet, has lost 122 relatives in this. And where are these people being interviewed on mainstream TV? They're being completely marginalized. So again, it's just talking points.
I'm sure. I'm sure the book you mentioned will probably have gone into that, but for those who there was a very good two-parter on Behind the Bastards just a couple of weeks ago by Robert Evans on how the liberal media failed to deal with fascism. In many ways, was complicit with fascism, with the rise of fascism in what we now call, of course, interwar Europe. And he focuses specifically on the U.S., with the New York Times being a major player in that normalization at the time, and of course Italy and Germany being the two other main case studies. And one thing that's kind of fascinating is a lot of things that you just said, of like even that person saying like it's electoral suicide. Those literal things, like those things were quite literally said about like, why don't you condemn anti-Semitism at the time? It was quite literally like,
Yes.
and there was even that argument that like, we will allow it's better for Hitler to come to power because he will then be moderated, because he will have to deal with the realities of the state or whatever. Or that was another argument, he's such a buffoon, he's such an idiot that he will expose the far right as being whatever. And how we are seeing this literally right now, we're quite those exact same arguments.
Oh my God, Elliot, it's so frustrating because I am seeing it in real time. The encroachment of the far right on all these public spaces. There was a report that came out the other day, or a few months ago, that there's over 100 far right extremists with security passes to the German parliament. Over 100. Like, there was an attempted coup. Like, they raided hundreds of residences and they found weapons caches, right? Weapons caches, like all over Germany. And the way it was reported was, oh, haha, look at this weird, eccentric group of people. They're extremely wealthy and they're connected and they had guns. Like, it would not take many special forces to launch a coup of some effect against Germany's capital. It wouldn't. It really wouldn't. They might not need one actually a year from now. But what strikes me about this is the spectacular unseriousness of this. And I can't help but think that if these people were brown, it would be taken far more seriously.
Of course, for me, that's like it's just not even. There's no questions about it.
Let me give you an example. So a few days ago, in the town of Solingen, a town actually quite famous because in 1993, 10 refugees were burned alive by an unknown far right assailant, unsolved murders. In the town of Solingen, a few days ago, a 26-year-old man, found to have been a Syrian man who claimed asylum here, stabbed several people and killed three German people in their 50s at a festival for diversity. And he claimed, Islamic State claimed that he was one of their members, right? So he attacked a festival of diversity because his thought process was, let me attack Germany in its most vulnerable place. He didn't attack conservatives. He attacked people who'd gathered to celebrate diversity. And his rationale, his calculus was, the country will implode over this because they will ascribe my actions to all Syrian refugees and all non-white people. He was confident in that assertion. Germany's reaction was to deport several dozen Afghan refugees, right, who had criminal records. Now, here's the thing. The level of urgency with which Germany acted in relation to this individual and others who they regarded as being in his camp, we are not seeing the same urgency in relation to the far right at all. At all. At all. And this is what frightens me. the failure to there's a saying, I can't remember it entirely, and it's a slightly ableist term, so I hesitate to use it. The saying about Germany not being able to see out of the brown eye or something, like
Yeah.
referring to Germany's past. When it comes to that, Germany doesn't have the vision to look at itself, to look at its own, to look at its homegrown extremism, even though we know that over 90% of acts of extremism in this country are committed by the far right.
Yeah.
Even though we know for a fact that the stats just came out, there were over 3,000 cases more of far right crime at this stage than there were last year. It's almost 10,000 this year compared to 6,000 this time last year, and Germany is not acting with urgency.
Yeah. 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 This is why for me, this is why that's a perfect example of why the culture war is so important. Or like let's call it a battle of discourses or whatever whatever terms you want to use here. Because I know culture war can be used in very bullshitty ways. By which I mean that we know there was this also like a stabbing attack against children in the UK about a month or so ago. I'm very bad with time now.
Yes.
And we found that the assailant, the assailant, was, I believe, underage or 19 or something, 17 or 19, something like that. And born and raised in Cardiff, I believe, and then moved to England or something like that. So they're born in Wales, moved to England, raised a British person. That did not stop the debate, quote unquote, to be about immigration, right? Because even though he is by definition not an immigrant, like by the very definition of that term, he is still an immigrant because that category is racialized. And that's
Yes.
where this is where these things kind of change, because at no point is there any debate on, if we speak about the UK specifically, on the BBC, Sky News, Channel 4, Guardian, Telegraph, what have you. At no point is there any debate whether Tommy Robinson is a British person or not. At no point, nothing he can ever do. Not a single act of hatred, anti-Semitism, even though he's very pro-Israel as well. Those things are not contradictory. People need to understand this. Obviously, white supremacy, all of that stuff, and Islamophobia being his, of course, main obsession. Nothing. He can quite literally commit a massacre, and he will not be deprived of citizenship, for example. That's not a thing that is even conceivable in that framework. Whereas if you do something very similar, or if you express a very hateful ideology, but let's say on Islamism, or as we saw with some of the ISIS cases at the time, your Britishness is what is being first and foremost targeted. Yes. And that says something very specific. It doesn't say you are no longer British because you're hateful. Because if that were the case, then anyone who's hateful would get the same treatment. In which case, you may not be comfortable with this kind of language, but you can at least argue, well, there seems to be some fairness about this. We say, okay, well, if Britishness is about, it's about fairness, it's about, I don't know, diversity, inclusivity, whatever. And if you kind of stray too far away from that path, you're labeled an extremist, whatever it might be. And maybe even your status as a British citizen, or not citizen necessarily, like that's a legal thing, but Britishness gets questioned, let's say.
Yes, conditional Britishness and deeper than that. And I love that we're on this point. It's conditional Britishness, and beneath all of this, you've noticed, obviously, the last few years, isn't it incredible how statelessness, the conversation, the rhetoric around removing citizenship has exploded. This was a discourse that did not exist 20 years ago. Removing citizenship. What's that thing about, like, those who burn books will one day burn people?
Yes.
The symbolic, but I rank the removal of citizenship alongside book burning.
Yes.
They are as insidious. They are trailers for the burning of books is a trailer for the feature film of mass murder and genocide. Absolutely. And I think the mass removal of citizenship, which is what the far right are planning in Germany. So a great piece came out by the investigative outlet Corrective. They found secret plans by the German far right, the mass deportation and the removal of citizenship of millions of migrants, including, in quote, the good ones. Now, Germany is a country that needs hundreds of thousands of immigrants every year for its economy to flourish. Hundreds of thousands. And the interesting thing with all of this is they will go on a charm offensive on one hand. So you have like Christian Lindner, the finance minister, will go to Ghana and say, do you want to move to Germany? And Ghanaians who've got great job prospects abroad burst out laughing. They said, we've heard how you treat black people, right? Now, I came to Germany as a black man. I speak good German. I pay my taxes. I earn good money here. I do my thing. I'm, in quotes, a good immigrant. And I was asked the other day how I felt about the AfD, if I was scared of the far right. And I said, no, I'm not scared of the far right. I'm scared of German complacency.
Yeah.
Because I get told to integrate. Here's the thing. My German is really good to the extent that I teach in German schools in German. A couple of weeks ago, I officiated a wedding in German, like for friends of mine. Like I'm integrated. That is not good enough.
No, it never is.
And here's the point, right? Whether we're good immigrants or in quotes bad ones, it will never be enough. And the dangerous thing now in the discourse is there's no connection to economic or social reality. When that report broke, the AfD, the far right, were at 20% in the polls. That should have wiped them out. They were trying so hard to keep that meeting private. They must be laughing because they're now between 70 to 19%. That's a huge percentage. What that shows is a huge number of Germans actually really couldn't care less. And
also because I do think the point about the economy is very interesting because fundamentally economic instability is good for fascism.
Yes.
Any kind of real like bad instability like Brexit times 10, let's say, of the sort that would of course happen if such a mass deportation were like happened, if it happened or whatever, is good for fascism because ultimately what they believe in a form of accelerationism. They want what they view as the current world to burn essentially because they think that they will rise from the ashes.
Yes.
Whether they burn in the process as well, of course, is not something that they calculate necessarily in the long term, but that's part of the ideology for sure. One thing that I find quite striking, even in how you were like how you're presenting this problem or problematic whatever right now, is I guess I'm just repeating a bit what you said. The complacency, the real, not the real, but like a misunderstood violence, or at least a underplayed or I don't know, underestimated. Yeah, that's the word. An underestimated form of violence is the silences. And for me, I've of course experienced this in a different way in the past 10 or so months since the genocide in Gaza started. Not that this is, obviously it's not about me specifically or whatever, but there was a version of that I was experiencing, either me personally or like a bunch of friends of mine around me here or like in other places, or people of color specifically in this case, where it's almost like we need to have two different personalities, if not more than that, masks on, right? And there's the mask where, it's the mask that you're with, I don't know, trusted loved ones, friends, family, whatever. And then there's the mask where you are with maybe other members of your family who are trusted only to a certain extent in the sense that they're not racialized, for example, and they may not understand certain things. Maybe they want to. It's not even necessarily like they mean badly or whatever, but they have a very specifically different experience. And that experience almost compels them to some form of silence. It's almost like sometimes I feel like the way their thought process could work is like if I digest too much information that could be too destabilizing. And I would have to re-question like some of my own, whether it's privileges, whether it's comforts, whether it's whatnot. And this is the key. A lot of these people are not necessarily comfortable in the sense of like they have it all, right? Privilege doesn't mean that your life is amazing. And relative, that's what we would say, relative privilege. And in the case of the people I think of, it's not that they, for example, have enough money to live until retirement and beyond very comfortably, and their kids and their grandkids and whatnot. They're actually a lot of the time, like it feels like 4 or 5 steps away from precarity. Like they're not immediately at the door of precarity, but it's like it's not that far away. And there is this sense of like and this is the generous interpretation. Of course, this doesn't apply to everyone, but it does apply to a percentage. And I think it's important. It's important to see this, not to kind of paint everything with a white brush, but to just understand that there is like a diversity of tactics that need to be applied in different contexts. And so, in the context of the one I have in mind, like relatives of mine who are not racialized, who are white, the way I kind of see it is that they need to understand that the precarity that I am experiencing, or that people even in worse off situations are experiencing even more violently, of course, and more like immediately, is something that they can connect to on a human level without necessarily thinking that this could happen to them immediately. Because there is a fear that a fear response that gets triggered. And that we see this a lot with global warming discourses and whatnot, where you tell people like, if we don't do something now, we're going to die tomorrow. Most people just paralyze. There is a sense of like, I just don't know what to do right now. I don't know what to do with the information you just gave me. And that's why for me, it's I'm saying this with the caveat here that I don't always do this well. I fail often, and it's very difficult to do. And as I mentioned earlier, with the case of Germany, I can get very emotional very quickly, in which case I try as much as I can to just take a step back and maybe restart the conversation tomorrow or whatever. But it's important for me to kind of have all of this at the same time, because I want to dismantle those discourses from within. I want to weaken those discourses from within. And I don't think it's sufficient to only tell them, hey, this is how much my people have suffered. Isn't this bad? Because they can say yes. They can say, yes, this is bad. But then the conclusion is still, what do I do with that? What can I do with this information? Right?
Oh, bingo. And this is why when I wrote the essay, I was very careful to include a paragraph about what next.
Yes.
Because you can say, look, the iceberg is melting, but what next? So I this isn't in the essay, this aspect, but there's something I've been thinking about for a while. I'll throw it out here now for the first time. German fascism will fail, right? It will fail because everyone will get miserable. And here's the thing I've been saying to people recently about why it will fail, what can be done to stop it before it emerges, before it comes to power. So what can be done to stop it before it comes to power is actually, in the final year before elections, the coalition government can go bold. And they can say, you know what? There's not enough affordable housing. The infrastructure is not good enough in so many ways, not digitized. We are not going to get everything done that we pledged to do, but let's start somewhere. And I would just say, throw up a ton of affordable housing in some part of Germany, right? Do it means tested, and base just build and say, look, here's a pledge to build more. We're going to throw up 1,000 units of affordable housing in the next year. And the reason I know they can do that is because they built a massive Tesla gigafactory around the corner, and they built a massive Amazon. It's political will. They built a massive shopping mall in the east that nobody needs. They built a massive Amazon skyscraper that I heard the other day is only going to have a half occupancy, right? They've got the money to do this. Because what happened when the Nazis got elected, they embarked on the biggest infrastructure spending program that Germany had ever seen. That is exactly what the AfD, I think, will do when they're in office. They'll have a big show, they'll put on some big infrastructure, they'll have signature projects, and people will be like, actually, the AfD aren't too bad, actually. So if the progressive forces want to stop fascism rising, they have to have their big show projects in the next year. That's what they have to do. Go out there, be bold, promise some exciting things, deliver 5% of them now, and say the other 95 are coming in office, but make the 5% super impressive. So everyone can go, great, we've got a plan. Because having a plan and a unified vision, that alone will allow people to shake off their fear. Because here's the thing, people are terrified of what's coming. The people who've accepted the reality of climate change or the arrival of fascism are terrified of what's coming. And so the next thing I'll say about this, and this is why fascism will fail from within, in German society specifically, you look at the example of Poland, right? What happened in Poland? There aren't enough white babies, aren't enough white people reproducing. So what they're doing is they're banning all abortion or trying to ban all abortion. What happens? The women of Poland went to the streets in spectacular numbers. You now have a bunch of women in Germany. Germany is a place that saw the biggest internal migration, I think, in modern European history from east to west, and the wall came down because women wanted to take advantage of the economic opportunities they perceived in the West. Those women have now grown up. A lot of them have got kids, or their aunts, or their doting godmothers, or they're just living free-spirited lives. Whatever they're doing, a lot of them are living in the West. What the AfD have proposed in their manifesto, in their own manifesto, they say bigger families, fewer migrants. Great. Let's say their plan works. Let's say they kick out all the migrants they can, including myself. They kick us all out. They put us in camps. They drown us, whatever they do to us. Great. Okay, here's the problem. You need more white babies, and you haven't got enough white babies. What's going to happen? Cut all women's rights. Good luck cutting the women's rights of millions of the most economically liberated women that Europe has ever seen. Good luck with that. And here's the big question they need to be asking the far-right politicians for the whole year until the election. Okay, here's the thing. Let's assume that your numbers will work out. We've reduced migration to this level that you want. Great. How many white babies do you want me to have? How many white babies do you want me to have? Is it 5.4? Is it 6.2? Is it 7.8? How many women do you want to breed for you under your new government, your new coalition? Because that question is the question that I've not heard a single mainstream journalist or any journalist ask a far-right politician when your end game is in place. And it's the same reason that the conservatives in the US were really cagey about Roe v. Wade, about abortion, because they didn't want to spook the horses.
Yeah.
They did not. There's a significant number of conservative white men, of far-right white men in Germany that haven't revealed to their white women in quote pejorative marks, how much they hate them. And there are millions of white German women who don't yet realize just how many white German men hate them.
Mm-hmm.
That is when this whole thing implodes. But unfortunately, that'll be years from now, long after they've done their terrible work on the non-white population of Germany. But that's why it will fail. You can put money on that.
Well, I completely agree. And I think it's very, very important to also be able to visualize that end, to be able to visualize that their failures, because by doing so, you're not accepting that their victory, for example, at the elections is inevitable. On the contrary, you're almost demystifying it to some extent.
Yes.
There is a sense, and I don't, like, if I dig deep within myself and I try and be honest about it, there is a part of me, a very, very tiny, tiny part of me that's like, I want to see what happens. There's just a tiny part of me. I want to see what happens. I don't want to. This is not rational. If I say this, I know, for example, if it's here, for example, I would be the target. So this is not rational in any way, shape, or form. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a bit of this almost like morbid curiosity that you do see expressed in, for example, the mainstream media. It's almost like it's a novelty, right? Or because they're not like, the really bad ones of the 30s or 40s. They're not like that. They're trying to put, I'm talking about how the discourse is often presented here. And they've tried to clean up act, and they have this and this and this and that. And also, we haven't had one in a while. What could go wrong? And we see this, like, I'm being a bit
go for it.
I'm being a bit silly here, but like this is almost said in almost those explicit terms in a lot of those circles. We have seen a lot of high-ranking mainstream American politicians, and this was maybe now it's a bit different since Biden dropped out. Talking like, how bad can it be under Trump again, right? Like, we've dealt with him for 4 years. How worse can it be for 4 more years or whatever? And this, of course, betrays a level of privilege and them thinking like, it's not going to affect them personally. And also a very deep cynicism about the world. Because fundamentally, yes, of course, some people will suffer and that will be sad. But hey, I get to cover it. I get to write about it. I get to create content out of it or whatever. And some people...
To write bestsellers. I get to withhold vital information of national security. Yes. I get of national importance. I get to withhold that so I can publish it in my best-selling book.
Yeah, and you're referring to that journalist who knew that Trump wanted to refuse the elections, and she didn't mention it until after it happened, and she released it in her book in the US.
Unreal.
So that's the thing that exists. That should also be called out, of course, for what it is. And what about the kind of the sentiment I'm trying to express here, not very well maybe, but this morbid curiosity, I think could be also not just like dismantled, of course, because that's not rational, and that's not for me. I wouldn't consider this good politics. Of course, I'm an anti-fascist in my politics, but more like try and understand where does that come from, and is there anything that can be done to again dismantle it from within? Because if it is about novelty, what you're also saying, and this is kind of like the generous interpretation of it, is that you absolutely hate your life. Your current present is just not satisfying. Nothing is happening. It's just not interesting enough. I'm not part of history. I'm not. My role is just that I can die tomorrow and it doesn't matter. Here is someone who's giving me like a hero arc where I can go battle I can go on the next crusade or whatever and battle the evil barbarian hordes or whatever the fuck. And that feels like a nicer story.
I love that you said this. I've loved that you said this. Do you know why? This is one of the biggest failures in the resistance to the far right, and I say this in my essay, I think, is the refusal to ignore the far right. Now, I'm not saying, what I mean by that is, of course, the far right's there. You have to pay attention to them. But when it comes to drawing up your vision for the perfect world, ignore the far right. And what I mean by that is, when you're imagining utopia, think of how you want things to be. Look, this is what I want for German people. I want people in the rural communities in the East, many of whom are struggling with deep drug addictions. I want them to have local bands playing in their communities. I want them to have youth centers. I want them to have transport. I want them to have economic opportunity. Someone said the other day, like that's not feasible. I said, look, imagine if you made a Tennessee out of a these small towns don't have infrastructure. Imagine if you built incredible music studios there and you invested in those areas and actually gave people something to do. And I don't mean like, I'm not saying like all fascism emerges from the narrative of being left behind. I'm not
No,
saying
no,
that.
no,
What I'm
no.
saying is,
But you're dismantling it from within. That's the point.
this is what
Yeah.
I want. I want that for Germans. I want affordable train travel. So if you had a really tough week with the family or in your job, you can get a 4-hour train to Cologne, to an affordable hotel and walk around and enjoy yourself by the waterfront. I want that to be the case. I don't want to be the preserve of the wealthy. This is what I want for Germans,
Yeah.
right? The singular failure of German activism at a mainstream level, German politics is you see the posters and it's like, don't vote for the right. Don't vote for the right. Or we are for the rights. We are for rights. We're for human rights, women's rights, animal rights. I'm like, you're still using the framing of the right. If I drove past your poster, if I went past it on a tram or train, all I would see was the rebuttal of the right. But I don't know what you stand for. It is not empowering enough. If you want a huge turnout, someone said the other day, someone said, you can't win an election off vibes, they said, as if Obama did not get elected off hope. Obama literally got
Most
elected on
elections
vibes.
is vibes.
Oh, come on. Yeah, of course it is. And here's the key. What fascists are very, very good at orchestrating right now is vibes. They have, if you go to the German countryside, if you go to the German East, you will understand the movement very, very well. They have a very seductive image of home, of purity, of nature, of countryside, of walks. It is no coincidence that the place where the far right is strongest is, in my opinion, the most beautiful, physically most beautiful part of Germany, Thüringen. It is like a wonderland. It's like the Rivendell in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Parts of France are the same thing. Yeah.
Oh, stunning. Because they have managed to marry a vision of utopia to a physical utopia. There is no reason why progressive forces cannot do the same, but they're so busy chasing the tails, which is why Tim Walz is the answer. The solutions, the antidotes to German fascism will be found in the East. The progressive visions, the exciting visions of the future, the pride marches will be found in the East. It's no coincidence that the two biggest marches, anti-fascist marches that happened in, I think, 2018, just before the lockdown. So basically, like they were cooking fascism before COVID. That's another story. But the reason they were doing it, the two biggest marches, one was called the Love March, and the second was called Indivisible. No reference to fascism there. That is the vision that existed in Germany 5 years ago. It's been lost, and they have to recapture it before time runs out.
Yeah.
But that is the positive way forward, to imagine a utopia and then act upon it. That's what I'm doing. That's what a lot of other activists are doing. I've got my utopia in my head. This podcast is part of it. But as long as we imagine that future, we're going to be fine.
Yeah, exactly. And so we'll slowly wrap up on this point. So I think it's a nice also note to end on. There is it's not necessarily. Okay, let me phrase this. Whether it's a vibes-based politics, whatever, or a policy-based politics, those do not have to be contradictory to one another. In fact, if you think of the US, for example, one of the biggest stories of the US is, the great reforms after World War II, and then the Civil Rights March, of course, and Civil Rights Act and whatnot in the 60s. And I'm referring after the 40s with FDR, the kind of rebuilding everything, massive infrastructure, massive all of that stuff. Of course, that's policies are very concrete things, but a lot of the kind of started with a vibe in the sense that if you think even about the UK, just to be closer to home here, the fact that after World War II, the hero of the war, Winston Churchill, was not re-elected. And in fact, instead, the person who was re-elected is the person who, not just him, of course, Eden, but the people around him. Was it Eden? No, what's the fuck? Attlee, yeah, sorry, yeah, of course not Eden. Attlee and just the socialist movement around him, some of which has also like mutual aid backgrounds, especially in Wales and England, proposing this thing that is, of course, the NHS as a vision, like concretely. It's just the notion, the very easy to understand, common sense decency that everyone should be taken care of under a universal healthcare system, that it should not be fair that if you are richer than your neighbor, therefore the care that you deserve for the cancer that your neighbor also has and that you have, that you should have better cancer treatment than your neighbor. It's like fundamentally, it just feels wrong to even say this out loud. And that's why actually, including in the UK right now, today, a lot of the people who propose to, effectively dismantle the NHS and privatize the NHS, they don't use these stories because these stories don't make them look good. So they use legalese and they say, efficiency, and they say a bunch of different other things and say, we want to improve care and whatnot, but they don't go into the details of things, right? On purpose, because otherwise it doesn't look good. And so for me, the fact that it's I like the idea, and I've been wrestling with this a bit, that we see even now in the US, I mean, with all of the caveats that I reserve towards the Democrats, and I've written about this extensively, but for now, there is something to be said about what can be done with a vibe shift. It doesn't mean that it's sufficient. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have, that it cannot have people being sacrificed that you should actually focus on, like for example migrants in this case, in the case of the US at the southern border, or Palestinians obviously, or other. It doesn't mean that you can't also tackle this at the same time, but there is something to be said about this old guy drops out, and virtually within 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, a bunch of people who were very, very terrified and depressed felt ecstatic. And it's like,
bingo.
We can do something with that, essentially.
Bingo, that's huge. Okay, and I love that you've mentioned this as we come to close on this point.
Yeah.
Tim Valls is a guy who has fought this stuff in the heartlands, right?
Yes.
Up close. This is why I think the solutions will come from the east of Germany, because they are the ones seeing up close, maintaining positivity, and not just positivity, but actually these progressive and excited visions. And they're an antidote because they can say, we're from here and we reject what you stand for. There's a reason why I've actually just increased my funding of those organizations. I give I would say, I think 40 euros a month, full disclosure. I give 40 euros a month to a mixture of pro-refugee, pro-migrant organizations and grassroots organizations in the east of Germany, one of which is called the Polylux Network, the other which is International Women's Space. Both outstanding, extraordinary organizations. Check them out.
Send me those links and I'll include those in the show.
Bingo, yeah. They're incredible organizations. So I think there's a couple of things to be done. The first is how to articulate a politics of hope. And the second is how do we get an effective attack line against the AFD, similar to the weird tag that has stuck to the Republicans. Now, here's the thing. If you look at the reason why the weird tag has stuck, which is fascinating, Americans, in terms of the cultural output, they regard themselves as the norm.
Yes.
Right? They're the norm. Right? Globally, they're the norm. American culture is the norm. So weird is genius because it's like the core American value is that we are the norm and you're weird.
Yeah.
That sounds ridiculous, but it's powerful. Now, here's the thing. The other day I was going through a list of the German values, right? I went through a list of the last couple of years, a survey of how do Germans see themselves. And then I went through that, and then I compiled a list of the core German values. Then I went through the AfD's manifesto, and then I was like, hang on a minute. These are all the ways in which the AfD's core manifestos, core values are contrary to values that Germans express themselves. AfD is a deeply un-German party. It's not transparent. Germans pride themselves on being transparent. It's not efficient. The numbers don't add up. Bang, 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 bang. These are the 7 values. And actually, what you're doing is contrary to like German interests and German values. Like, we haven't had that conversation. If they're talking about identity politics, let's make it about identity.
Yeah.
What is the American identity? It's that we're normal. Oh, they're not normal. Oh, they're weird. Sorry, they're weird. I don't know. It's slightly ableist language. They're weird. And not good weird. They're bad weird. I think I'm good weird. They're bad weird.
Yeah, me too.
And again, absolutely, and proudly so earlier. And the other thing I'll say about in the German context, I think there is an efficient and effective line of attack. Steer clear of calling people Nazis, because for that, even if it's an accurate description, it's a badge of honor. They'll say, "Oh, I'm a nationalist. I'm a socialist. I'm a revolutionary. What's wrong with that?" What you need to say is actually, what you're doing is contrary to the values that many Germans hold dear. That's powerful.
Yeah.
And if they can find a way to articulate that, both a utopian vision and an antidote, then I think the country can still pull this round.
Yep.
They've got a year, they've got time. It's not over yet, but they need to get working.
Mm-hmm. I can't not say this because it's so interesting. I will kind of, let's say this is my wrap up, and then you can have the final word. The image of, okay, speaking of good weird, there's an episode of Star Trek, because I have to go there, where in the Next Generation you have Picard going to his brother's hometown, because he's supposedly a Frenchman, and he goes to his brother's hometown in France, and he kind of sees that his brother lives in almost pre-technological, like almost like a Luddite in the popular conception of the term Luddite, not in the historical sense. And so he works the land. He clearly doesn't. He has electricity, but I think nothing more than that. He doesn't have what we would call internet, stuff like that. And what's kind of fascinating about that episode of the Next Generation of Star Trek is that it's sort of implied in that world that you can have both. That you can have high tech, high advanced, which represented by Picard on the Enterprise and whatnot, which is very diverse and whatnot. And you can also have the quieter life, rural life, whatnot, which is also diverse. This is important in Star Trek. And the point is that we mentioned about trying to imagine the world in which fascism is already kind of like not thinking about them. Like, we're beyond them. We're just, they have already been defeated. And now we're thinking of like, what's the day after? This is kind of the fictional version of that, in the sense that it's 300 years into the future, 400 years in the future, whatever. And we're not even debating things like racism and whatever, because like this is an ancient thing that no one has to deal with anymore. And this, when you kind of take this as the premise, it kind of opens up a number of things, because suddenly it's almost like, oh, well, this feels easier than it felt prior, right?
Yes.
And the sense that I see a number of times, this is not all the time, of course, but it is an element of this. You mentioned it yourself as well. And we see an element of this as well with the far right in France, for example, and whatnot, is that when they think of like the idyllic life, the village life, the, knowing small town communities, whatnot, that is not a right-wing version. That's not a right-wing vision of the world. It becomes a right-wing vision of the world when you need to exclude a certain kind of people or type of people or whatever from that same thing that you think is good for you.
Yes.
And that's where I think that's what I mean by dismantling it from below. Because there's no point being in my opinion, there's no point being the left if the only thing that you're proposing can feel like you don't want that for those people. You don't want them to have the quiet, again, even as romanticized as it is.
Yes.
On an emotional level, it feels good. And it can feel very good, especially if you contrast it with the epidemic of loneliness that we're all going through. That is a global problem with neoliberalism and whatnot.
Bingo.
They can kind of feel like, okay, maybe they're not perfect or whatever. But I mean, again, all of this is romanticized to various extents. But it feels good. And the point is that when we think about the vibe shift and whatnot, there has to be a way to marry a politics of feeling good, a politics of hope, as abused as that term is by mainstream politicians, of course.
Yes.
But we have to find a way to marry that with concrete, good progressive policies. And I'll end on this. We've seen a shift even within the DNC. And again, I have so many problems with the DNC, but it's not important for now. The Democratic National Convention, for those who are listening. Where mentions of unionization and unions and certain LGBTQ rights and whatnot, again, with all of the caveats that lots of people online have already yelled about. It's not important for this specific thing. But much more than we ever did before. There's been a renormalization, because this was already normalized in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and then it's been slowly denormalized under neoliberalism, and being in the union, for example, became almost like a dirty word. And for those who want the very concrete references, you can just watch like the first, I think, 5 seasons of Seinfeld, in which it's kind of the butt of the joke is actually that, oh, this person is a union man or whatever, lazy worker or whatever it might be. Now we're renormalizing being a union as being something that's good and actually cool and fun and hopeful. And because there is also a semblance, not just that, collective bargaining, fighting for your rights and whatnot, but a community about a very specific thing, or you have this thing in common. You may not have virtually anything else in common, but you have this thing in common. And this could be a way for like almost moving the pieces on the chessboard or whatever metaphor you want to use a bit forward, 1 step forward, 2 steps forward. And there's no reason why we can't Mary, how Michelle Obama says like hope is making a comeback. The speech that she gave and that Barack Obama gave, for me, were almost meaningless in the actual content, but somehow it felt good for a lot of people. And so, how can we get that sense? Why that sense of feeling good? Because why would you want people not to feel good? That makes no sense. Let them
Oh my
feel good.
goodness!
That's fine.
And I love you. I love that
Yeah,
you've said this. And to add to this and to close on
please, yeah,
this, I think you've
please.
articulated so well. If you look at the things that Germany is doing really well, one thing in particular is football culture.
Mhm.
And I wonder what role football will have to play in all of this as time goes on, because the fan bases, the supporters groups, the ultras, the ones that really galvanize the social movements are overwhelmingly progressive.
Mhm.
And in a country that is trending towards fascism, I am very, very sure that the conversation, the role they have to play, is a significant one as time goes forward. If you look at the huge clubs, Bayern Munich, Borussia Dortmund, these are clubs that when smaller clubs were sanctioned for basically chanting anti-fascist slogans, they paid their bills.
Mhm.
Babelsberg got fined because their supporters chanted Nazis out. That was ruled to be anti-discriminatory. They got fined for it, and Borussia Dortmund and Bayern Munich paid their fines. I think, sorry, St. Pauli and Borussia Dortmund paid their fines.
Mhm.
Bayern Munich caused such uproar over Bayern sponsorship by Qatar Airways. They forced an AGM to be closed down. People walked out, and that ended the sponsorship. So now that Bayern Munich are no longer sponsored by Qatar, there is a huge progressive movement within football clubs in Germany among supporter bases, and that's a positive vision. That's something Germans can point at and go, look, we get this right.
Yeah.
Our fan culture, our fan bases, our supporters, we get this right. This is something we can be proud of as Germans. And so when articulating a vision of hope, Germany can say, if we treat the average German citizen as well as most German clubs treat their fans, we're going to be okay. And
Mhm.
that is hugely exciting. It's important. It's multicultural, it's diverse. And the far right have got a massive problem there because a lot of people are drawing a comparison between 1930s Germany and now. The big difference is this. In 1930s Germany, you did not have a manager of a football team that was proudly multicultural and diverse. You did not have a manager of a team like Nagelsmann who came out and condemned fascism explicitly. You didn't have that. So this internal tension in Germany means that the far right is not going to have its own way in terms of messaging in the next 5 years, whatever happens with their political prospects. They are always going to have the biggest stars in the country speaking out against them. And that
Mhm.
is a problem for them they have not anticipated. So if we're talking about a politics of hope in a very concrete sense, at a social level, not just a political one, I think actually football's going to have a massive role to play. A massive role to play.
Amen to that. I don't have anything else to add. Do you have where can folks follow you? Anything you're doing?
Yeah,
Plug
you can
away.
check us out. My podcast is the main thing I'm working on right now. So I do that with the
Hmm.
great Ryan Hunt. It's called Stadio. Um, Stadio.football is the website. You want to check it out. At the moment, I'm working on two pieces of work. For the first time ever, I'm talking about this. I'm working on a piece of fiction and a piece of non-fiction at the moment.
Amazing.
That's news to you as well, isn't it, Elliot?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I work on both of those as we speak. So please keep an eye out for those. And also, yeah, just one last piece of advice. Solidarity that I'm going through it at the moment. Every little bit counts.
Yeah.
I really believe this. Every conversation, every face to face, every bit of empathy you can show, it all matters.
Yeah.
It's given me strength in the last few months, and I think it will continue to in what could be a grim few months ahead. But I still have
Mhm.
hope. I still have hope.
Amazing. Musa, thanks for coming on again.
My pleasure. My pleasure.